Welcome to the InnoGuide podcast. I'm your host, Bob Boudelier. This podcast, my website, and my weekly newsletter focus on helping you discover the secrets of innovation. Since I don't rely on paid ads, I want to thank our customers who subscribe to our AI Fusion Kickstarter program and those who leverage AI Fusion product development and coaching to bring human-centered AI into their organizations. You can find us at www.innoguide.net. In this episode, number 71, we'll be sharing part 2 of Genius Makers by Cade Metz. This book delves further back in time from the previous podcasts I've had into the history of where many of the players in AI have come from, who brought large language models to where they are today, what companies they work for, how they switched around, and it's insightful to understand some of the history behind it to inform us where this might be going and who some of the players are who might guide us to get there. Without further ado, please enjoy this episode. Welcome to the InnoGuide podcast, where we share the works of authors and mentors to guide innovation. Chapter 11, The Face of God. Chapter 11 opens on a scene that feels almost mythic, a neural network staring into millions of images and slowly learning to see, not just detecting edges or shapes like early computer vision systems, but to recognize faces, real human faces across angles, lighting conditions, backgrounds, and expressions. For the engineers building these systems, the moment these networks achieve this capability feels almost religious. Hence the chapter's title, The Face of God. This is the chapter where AI crosses an emotional line, not because the machines become sentient, not at all, but because the systems begin perceiving the world in ways that mirror human perception, and that realization shakes everybody involved just a bit. Teaching a machine to see a face. The breakthrough doesn't begin in a cathedral of science, it begins inside of Facebook. The company has oceans of data, billions of photos uploaded by users, and the AI team realizes that deep learning finally might be strong enough to detect faces with almost human-level accuracy. But this wasn't trivial. Early face recognition systems were brittle. They worked in controlled environments under perfect lighting with static poses. Facebook's photos were chaos, backlit selfies, vacation shots, blurry crowds, strange angles, half-covered faces. If deep learning could handle this, it would be a revolution. FAIR researchers built a model called Deep Face. What's remarkable is how quickly it surpassed conventional models. Using a 9-layer neural network and millions of labeled images, Deep Face reached 97% accuracy on a standard benchmark. Humans averaged only 95%. A machine was now matching human performance. It's actually exceeding it. This is the kind of result that doesn't just impress engineers, it changes their worldview. When a model can look at a grainy, off-angle, party photo and tell you who's in it with better accuracy than another person, you realize you are stepping into new territory. The oh my God moment. Researchers describe a moment that felt almost spiritual. After training a convolutional network on millions of Facebook images, they examine one of the internal layers, one deep inside the network, far from the input or the output. And staring back at them is something uncanny. The network has invented the concept of a face. Not because anyone programmed it, not because anyone showed it idealized examples, but because at scale, the network discovered that faces are recurring visual entities that matter. It learns the nose, the mouth, the eyes, the symmetry, the structure. It learns the idea of faceness. This layer, this emergent internal representation, looked like a Platonic form, a mathematical ideal of a human face. For many engineers, this is the moment they stop thinking of deep learning as a tool and start thinking of it as a phenomenon, something organic, something that uncovers structure in the world rather than being forced to follow rules. And from my vantage point, having spent decades watching machines evolve, this is exactly the kind of moment that shifts entire industries. When a machine not only matches human ability, but begins organizing information in human-like ways, you're no longer dealing with clever code, you're dealing with a new kind of system. The power and the danger. But with that power came immediate ethical controversy. If Facebook could identify faces in any uploaded photo, faces of users, non-users, bystanders, children, then the company suddenly held an enormous amount of power, and they knew it. Around the same time, Google built a competing model that could identify not just faces, but thousands of object categories. Apple introduced Face ID. Baidu built facial recognition tools used in public safety systems. Governments, especially China's, began investing in face detection infrastructure. AI wasn't just recognizing cats anymore, it was recognizing people. And Metz highlights the uncomfortable realization that followed. Just because you can build something doesn't mean you should. Inside Facebook, researchers knew deep face was a scientific triumph, but leaders also understood it could trigger public backlash and regulatory scrutiny. So Facebook toned down its public messaging, even as their internal capabilities surged. This is where Chapter 11's emotional undertone hits the hardest. AI had crossed from harmless novelty into morally complicated territory. A shift in the AI narrative. Up to this point in the book, this story is about ingenuity, scientists solving problems once considered impossible. But this chapter marks the moment when the world begins asking harder questions. What are the boundaries of AI vision? Who controls the training data? How should companies wield capabilities that the public doesn't fully understand? If a machine can identify anyone, anywhere, instantly, what does that mean for privacy? This is also when the public begins seeing the downsides: surveillance, bias, misuse, governmental overreach. And for my own work guiding teams through innovation waves, this is a familiar arc. Every breakthrough technology is born in excitement, but it matures in the shadow of responsibility. This chapter captures that turning point beautifully and uncomfortably. Why does this matter? The chapter is about more than face recognition. It's about whether society is prepared for what AI can do. Machines now see us, understand us, recognize us. And that changes the relationship between humans and technology in a way no prior invention has. The face of God isn't about divinity. It's about revelation. The moment researchers look at a machine and realize it understands something profound about the world, including us. Chapter 12. Mastery. If the last chapter showed us how machines learned to see, this chapter is where machines learn to play, and not just play but dominate. This is where DeepMind steps fully into the global spotlight, revealing an AI that doesn't just match human intuition, it exceeds it. And the area they chose wasn't chess or Atari or image classification. It was a game so subtle, so complex, so profoundly human, that for centuries it's been held up as the ultimate test of intuition. Go. The impossible game. For decades, Go was considered out of reach for computers. While chess has around 35 possible moves per turn, Go has roughly 200. The search space is so vast that traditional algorithms, brute force, or even clever pruning collapse under the sheer volume of possibilities. Go is not calculation. Go is intuition. It's pattern recognition, flow, balance, and long-term strategy. And that made it perfect for neural networks. Because intuition and pattern recognition, that's exactly where deep learning thrives. DeepMind's secret project. Inside DeepMind, Demis Hassabis and his team began building an AI that could learn to play Go the same way a human does, by looking at millions of positions, absorbing patterns, and playing itself repeatedly until it forms a sense of shape, influence, and strategy. They called the system AlphaGo. In the early days, AlphaGo was quietly, almost embarrassingly bad. It made amateur mistakes, it misread ladders, it ignored territory, but its strength was not in hand-engineered tactics, it was in learning. And once it began learning, it improved at a pace no human could match. The team fed it thousands of professional games. They let it play itself millions of times against itself, and slowly the spark appeared. Moves became sharper, shapes became clearer. The network began developing preferences, the same way human professionals develop style and intuition. It was no longer a rule-based system. It was a student turning into a master. The first public test. Before facing the legendary Lee Sedol, AlphaGo was quietly tested against a European champion, Fan Wei, in London. Fan Wei lost, not barely, not by fluke, but decisively. When the news reached the Go world, the reaction was disbelief. Masters assumed there had been a mistake. Some thought Fan Wei must have been ill. Others believed AlphaGo must have been given illegal advantages. DeepMind had shocked an entire global community overnight. The leader's view, why this matters. From my vantage point, having led engineering and innovation teams for decades, this moment represents the heart of technological transformation. Mastery emerges slowly and then suddenly. Systems that looked crude and limited for years suddenly hit a threshold of capability, and once they cross that threshold, they leap ahead rapidly. AlphaGo is the embodiment of this phenomenon. The Lee Sedol match. The world didn't truly wake up to AI's power until AlphaGo faced Lee Sedol, one of the greatest Go players of all time, a man whose intuition was so revered that commentators described his moves using words like spiritual. The match was streamed globally. Hundreds of millions watched. Commentators prepared to analyze AlphaGo's collapse. And then came move 37 in Game 2. A move so unexpected, so unconventional, that Sedol literally stood up from the table and walked out in shock. Go historians call it creative, beautiful, the kind of move that separates masters from disciples. Except this time, the master wasn't human. AlphaGo wasn't just strong. It wasn't just accurate. It wasn't just fast. It was creative. That one move changed the world's perception of AI. It suggested that neural networks could go beyond copying human patterns. They could discover entirely new ones. AlphaGo went on to win the series 4-1. Lee Sedol described the experience not as defeat, but as revelation. I feel like I'm playing the future, he said. Why DeepMind chose Go? Metz emphasized something subtle but important. DeepMind didn't choose Go to create a spectacle. They chose it because Go represents the kind of problem-solving humans excel at: pattern, intuition, complexity, and strategy. If AI could master Go, it could master other domains shaped by ambiguous signals and long-term planning. Domains like protein folding, logistics optimization, climate modeling, molecular design, and autonomous systems. In other words, Go is a proxy for intelligence itself. The aftermath. The world reorders itself. AlphaGo's victory sent tech companies scrambling. Google saw confirmation that its DeepMind bet was correct. Facebook and Baidu accelerated their own reinforcement learning projects. Governments began investing heavily in national AI strategies. The public realized AI was no longer sci-fi. And inside DeepMind, the win was not a victory lap. It was a starting point. They immediately began working on new systems: AlphaGo Zero, Alpha Zero, Mu Zero. Each one more powerful, more general, and more efficient than the last. Why does this chapter matter? Because this marks the moment AI goes from clever to transcendent. From my perspective, here's what I see. AlphaGo didn't prove that machines can beat humans at games. It proved that machines can discover knowledge we never taught them. And that's what mastery looks like. And that's why this chapter is one of the more important turning points in this entire story. Chapter 13. Power. This chapter marks a turning point, not in science this time, but in structure, influence, and control. The breakthroughs of earlier chapters created a new reality. Whoever controlled AI research now controlled the future, and suddenly the world's largest tech companies were reorganizing themselves around that truth. But in this chapter, we zoom in on the moment corporate strategy and scientific ambition collide. What had once been an academic pursuit was now a battle over power: talent power, compute power, data power, and political power. Google remakes itself around AI. Google's acquisition of DeepMind was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of Google's transformation into an AI-first company. Internally, leadership knew that if deep learning could crack vision, speech, translation, and strategic games, it could eventually reshape every product. So Google did something profound. They reorganized the entire company, shifting critical divisions under AI leadership and creating pathways for research to flow directly into products. Jeff Dean, the legendary engineer who created MapReduce and Bigtable, became one of the primary stewards of Google's AI vision. His technical credibility gave him a kind of gravitational pull. Researchers wanted to work with him. Engineers trusted him. Leadership listened to him. And in this chapter, you see the inversion of power dynamics. For the first time in Google's history, the researchers, not the product managers, were setting the direction. DeepMind versus Google Brain, the quiet power struggle. Even as Google embraced deep learning, subtle tensions grew internally. There were now two elite AI groups: Google Brain, the homegrown engineering-driven team, and DeepMind, the ambitious, secretive London-based lab with philosophical goals. Both were brilliant, both were productive, both were expensive, both wanted access to Google's compute, and both believed they held the key to Google's future. Metz captures this tension masterfully. The rivalry was polite, academic even, but very real. DeepMind believed it should be the crown jewel, the engine of AGI. Google Brain believed it should guide the company's AI transformation. And from my own experience managing global engineering teams, this is exactly the kind of internal competition that can either sharpen innovation or fracture it. The power of compute. This chapter repeatedly turns to one critical truth: compute is power. The biggest breakthroughs were going to the groups with the biggest clusters: TPUs, GPUs, distributed training, massive data sets. These assets weren't just tools, they were leverage. He who controls compute could explore bigger models, train longer, and push beyond existing limits. DeepMind needed enormous compute for its reinforcement learning systems. Google Brain needed enormous compute for translation, speech, and search. Both watched each other with a mix of respect and strategic caution. Facebook and Baidu respond. While Google was restructuring itself around AI, other giants were refusing to be left behind. Facebook expanded FAIR under Jan LeCun and began integrating deep learning into ranking, moderation, and vision. With billions of photos and posts flowing through its system daily, Facebook possessed the world's richest social data set, fuel for any neural network. Baidu, powered by Andrew Ng, built a trans-Pacific AI operation with labs in Silicon Valley and Beijing. They recruited aggressively, published prolifically, and became a central player in China's national AI push. This wasn't just academic competition anymore. It was industrial competition, national competition, geopolitical competition. AI had moved from the lab to the boardroom, and now to the global stage. The rise of corporate gatekeepers. Metz points out a critical shift happening beneath the surface. The most important AI research was no longer happening in universities. It was happening inside companies. This created a profound imbalance. Companies controlled the data, the compute, the talent, the publication pipeline. The universities, they were being left behind. For the first time in the history of computer science, the frontier of research moved behind corporate walls. This is where the chapter's title, Power, comes into full view. Ethical tension. As the private sector consolidated AI expertise, ethical concerns rose in tandem. If Google, Facebook, DeepMind, and Baidu were the only places capable of training frontier models, who was watching the watchers? Who was responsible for alignment, for safety, for governance? This wasn't fear-mongering. It was a realistic assessment of power concentration. And if I step into my coaching and strategy voice for a moment, this is the pattern you see whenever a breakthrough technology becomes indispensable. Electricity, the internet, the semiconductor, now AI. Control shifts rapidly into the hands of those who can scale the fastest. Why does this chapter matter? Well, chapter 13 is about mastery of the ecosystem. The scientific breakthroughs were breathtaking, but the consolidation of power around them was just as significant. By the time we get to the end of this chapter, 3 truths are obvious. 1, AI's future could be shaped by a handful of companies. 2, the competition between these companies was accelerating. And 3, the stakes were no longer academic. They were societal. This chapter sets the stage for the next act of the story, where ambition, rivalry, and the desire to steer the future of intelligence collide, sometimes elegantly and sometimes violently. Chapter 14, Belief. In the last chapter, we examined the consolidation of AI power inside corporations. This chapter flips the lens inward, towards the minds of researchers themselves, the belief systems that drive them. Here, Metz shows us something essential. AI advances not only through code and compute, but through conviction. And few people embodied conviction more than Geoff Hinton. The Church of the Neural Network. By the mid-2010s, deep learning had already transformed vision, speech, and translation. AlphaGo had stunned the world. Face recognition was nearing human performance. Neural nets were everywhere. But inside the research community, something more delicate was happening. A shift in faith, not religious faith, but intellectual faith. For decades, Hinton had been an outlier, a gentle heretic, a carpenter-turned-scientist who insisted neural networks were the path forward, even when the field laughed at him. But now Hinton's ideas weren't just validated, they were gospel. His colleagues, Bengio, LeCun, and an entire generation of younger researchers were watching the results come in, and the results were clear. Scaling laws were real. Bigger models, more data, more compute. They weren't plateauing. They were improving, often dramatically. In this chapter, Metz captures the emotional weight of this moment. Hinton finally believed the world believed him. The faith in scale. A central theme of the chapter is the belief shared by Hinton, Sutskever, and many at Google and DeepMind that scaling deep networks will eventually produce something like general intelligence. This is the belief system that later gives birth to the GPT-style models, LLM scaling laws, and eventually the modern generative AI boom. Inside Google Brain, engineers were quietly discovering the same truth. Larger networks perform better. Deeper networks captured richer structure. More data always helped, and optimization was improving faster than expected. This wasn't a theory anymore. It was an empirical pattern, a law of the emerging AI universe. From my point as a leader who's guided teams through waves of innovation, this chapter reveals something fundamental. When a field discovers a predictable path to progress, belief becomes fuel. Engineers work bolder, labs move faster, companies take bigger bets. The fragment within the faith. But belief also created tension. Remember Bengio's heresy in Chapter 10? His concern that deep learning needed symbolic reasoning, causality, and structure? Chapter 14 shows how deep the rift had become. Hinton believed scale was enough. Bengio believed scale was incomplete. And LeCun was somewhere in the middle, optimistic about scale, but certain that deep learning needed architectural innovation, not just brute force. These weren't petty disagreements. They were worldview splits. And the stakes were enormous. If Hinton was right, AGI might simply emerge from big models. If Bengio was right, the field might run into a wall. If LeCun was right, the path forward might require new designs, not just bigger ones. This chapter captures that tension without dramatizing it. Metz shows it as what it truly is, an intellectual family debating the future of their own creations. Google's quiet confidence. Meanwhile, inside Google, belief in deep learning wasn't just philosophical, it became operational. Teams across the company were reorganizing entire products around neural nets. Search, Photos, Gmail, Translation, Assistant, Waymo's perception stack. The company's internal culture had shifted. AI was no longer a research add-on, it was the backbone. This belief wasn't blind optimism. It was grounded in performance curves, product wins, and real-world results. Google now believed what Hinton had believed since the 80s, and that belief shaped the company's direction for the next decade. DeepMind's belief in mastery. While Google applied deep learning to products, DeepMind applied belief to ambition. AlphaGo's victory had ignited a fire inside the London lab. The team saw that neural nets could discover strategies humans never imagined, and if they could master Go, what else could they master? Their roadmap grew bold. StarCraft, protein folding, robotics, planning, multi-agent systems. But beneath all these goals was one unifying conviction. Learning systems could eventually reason. This is where belief and ambition fuse, where DeepMind's pursuit of AGI becomes not just a vision, but a mission. Why does this chapter matter? Because it's not about algorithms, it's about ethos. It's about the belief systems that shape the decisions of people building the future. Because technology doesn't advance solely through logic, it advances through conviction, persistence, arguments, rivalries, and faith in an idea before the evidence is fully complete. Every major breakthrough depends on unreasonable belief, not belief despite the evidence, but belief ahead of the evidence. Hinton believed before anyone else. Then the world believed him. Now the belief itself was accelerating progress. We close on this arc. AI is no longer just a field. It is a movement, a belief system with its own momentum. Chapter 15. Origin Stories. Chapter 15 is a pause in the action, but not a slowdown. It's where Metz pulls back the curtain and lets us see where key figures of modern AI actually came from. Because you can't understand why today's AI leaders think the way they do without understanding their beginnings. This chapter weaves together the backstories of the people who shaped deep learning: Hinton, LeCun, Bengio, Sutskever, Hassabis, Ang, not to romanticize them, but to reveal a pattern. The people who reinvented AI came from outside the traditional mold, or walked away from it. Their origin stories are stories of divergence, and that divergence is what allowed them to see what the mainstream could not. The outsider thread, Hinton's unusual path. Metz revisits Geoff Hinton's early life with more texture here. Hinton grew up surrounded by intellectual eccentricity, family members who crossed boundaries between psychology, physics, mathematics, and philosophy. This wasn't a household that worshipped credentials. It worshipped ideas. It explains why Hinton never fully adapted to traditional academia. He was too curious, too cross-disciplinary, too unwilling to accept that AI must take the symbolic route laid out by established researchers. And the origin story moment Metz highlights is simple but profound. Hinton didn't choose neural networks because they were fashionable. He chose them because they matched how he believed the mind worked. That conviction, borderline stubbornness, is what allowed him to push through decades of rejection. As someone who's coached hundreds of engineers and founders, I can tell you in every story of breakthrough, there's always someone who refuses to move with the crowd. Sometimes it was me. Hinton was that person here. The hacker thread, Yann LeCun's story. LeCun's origin story reads like a hacker myth. Growing up in France, he wasn't a prodigy from elite institutions. He was a kid obsessed with electronics, tinkering with circuits, building things by hand, and teaching himself how machines behave. He enters computer science not through theory, but through engineering instinct, through the joy of building something that works. And that, Metz emphasizes, is exactly why convolutional neural networks came from LeCun. He didn't try to mimic the brain abstractly. He tried to engineer a perceptual system layer by layer. His origin was practical, hands-on, grounded in systems thinking. In other words, LeCun built CNNs because he saw vision as an engineering problem, not as a philosophical one. The difference in viewpoint becomes incredibly important later as FAIR and Google Brain evolved into production-driven AI engines. The philosopher thread, Yoshua Bengio. Bengio's childhood and early academic life were defined by introspection, where Hinton was guided by pattern and intuition, and LeCun by engineering pragmatism. Bengio was driven by a more philosophical curiosity. What is knowledge? How does abstraction work? What does it mean to understand something? His origin story is steeped in theory, structure, and questions that border on cognitive science. This background explains why Bengio eventually becomes the voice advocating for symbolic reasoning and causal models. He wasn't rejecting deep learning, he was trying to complete it. I'll put it plainly the way I'd explained it to a founder. Hinton wanted the brain. LeCun wanted the machine. Bengio wanted the mind. The engine thread, Ilya Sutskever. Sutskever's origin story is one of intensity. Others in the field were passionate. Ilya was obsessed. He lived inside the math. He pushed experiments further than others would. He trained models until GPUs melted, sometimes literally. He entered Hinton's orbit with the same energy that later fuels OpenAI. His key trait wasn't just talent, it was relentlessness. Sutskever's story reveals the next generation of AI leaders, not just tinkerers, but people who believe scaling and experimentation are the engines of discovery. The prodigy thread, Demis Hassabis. Hassabis' life reads like someone training for AGI development from childhood. Chess master, game designer, neuroscientist, entrepreneur. His origin story is unified by one idea, complexity. He loved mastering complex systems, understanding them, simulating them, and beating them. This is why DeepMind became the home for reinforcement learning. Hassabis was chasing the learning agent idea long before industry cared about it. The evangelist thread, Andrew Ng. Ng's origin story is different. He is not the outsider, philosopher, or prodigy. He's the evangelist, the one who believed AI should be democratized. His work creating online courses and building Baidu's giant research engine reflected this deep belief. AI shouldn't stay locked inside elite labs. It should spread. His path reveals the importance of scale not just in models, but in people. Why these stories matter. Metz's point in this chapter is subtle but powerful. AI didn't emerge from one worldview. It emerged from the collision of many. And from my vantage point, mentoring innovators, every transformation needs all of these archetypes. The outsider, the builder, the thinker, the engine, the visionary, and the amplifier. This chapter shows how each origin story contributed a different necessary ingredient. No one person could have built modern AI alone. but together their combined perspectives became the foundation of the deep learning revolution. Chapter 16. Jump. The previous chapters trace the rise of belief power and origin stories. This chapter drops us directly into the moment AI makes its next massive leap, the moment the field realizes that the next frontier isn't simply perception or pattern recognition, it's language. This is where the story shifts from machines that see and machines that play to machines that read, write, and understand. And with that shift comes a jump so profound that many inside the field realize they were standing on the edge of a new era. The Spark, a machine that can describe images. Let's begin with a vivid demonstration. A system built at Google that could look at an image and generate a coherent sentence describing it. Not a keyword list, not a category label, not a template, a sentence. Bird stands on a branch. A group of people are sitting at a dining table. A baby is playing with a ball. Before this moment, deep learning systems could identify objects with increasing accuracy. They could classify images, highlight bounding boxes, even detect subtle patterns. But this was different. This model wasn't just identifying pixel patterns, it was expressing meaning. For the researchers involved, the shock wasn't that it worked, it was how effortlessly it worked once the architecture was right. The breakthrough came from pairing convolutional networks to understand the image with recurrent neural networks, specifically LSTMs, long short-term memories, to produce fluid language. Suddenly, vision and language weren't separate research problems. They were merging into a single system. As someone who's watched emerging tech shift industries, this is exactly the kind of inflection point where the world doesn't grasp what just happens, but researchers know it immediately. The boundary line just moved. Language as the next frontier. If a machine could describe an image in natural language, what else could it do with language? Google, already flush with deep learning successes in vision and speech, began placing huge bets on machine translation and language modeling. The old rule-based translation systems, those clunky engines that rearrange dictionary entries according to grammars, were about to be swept aside. Neural transformation didn't translate words, it translated meaning. Metz captures this shift beautifully. Traditional translation pipelines built by armies of linguists over decades were suddenly being outperformed by a system that essentially taught itself. Not only was it better, but it was simpler. A simple, giant network learning end-to-end. Inside Google, researchers knew immediately how big this was. When neural translation surpassed the old system in internal tests, executives pushed for rapid adoption. In a matter of months, Google Translate quietly switched its backend to an all-neural system. Users noticed instantly. Sentences sounded more human, grammar improved, semantics flowed. Paradigm shifts are rarely slow. They are sudden, quiet flips where the new system outperforms the old so decisively that change becomes irreversible. This chapter, titled Jump, captures this perfectly. The human reaction, unease and awe. When Google Translate upgraded, some linguists celebrated. Others felt uneasy. If a machine could process language with this level of nuance, what did that say about the nature of language itself, about creativity, about human uniqueness? This unease spread into other domains, because if deep nets could understand images and text, what came next? Complex reasoning, creative writing, dialogue, intelligent assistance, knowledge synthesis? This chapter hints at the beginnings of these ideas. It's the first moment the book suggests, subtly, that general-purpose language models might become the spine of future AI. DeepMind's parallel experiments. While Google Brain pushed language understanding forward, DeepMind continued expanding its reinforcement learning systems, applying them to increasingly diverse environments, physics simulations, planning tasks, multi-step challenges. But even as DeepMind couldn't ignore what was happening in language, language was the ultimate interface, the universal API for human cognition, the connective tissue of intelligence. AI needed to read, write, and reason in sequences to grow stronger. The jump as a turning point. This chapter's title works at two levels. The technical jump, from recognition to understanding, from perception to semantics. And the psychological jump, researchers realizing language might be the key to moving toward AGI. From my point as a strategist and builder, this is the moment the field stopped thinking of intelligence as narrow tasks, vision, translation, go, and started thinking in capabilities, perception, abstraction, communications, reasoning. This jump wasn't a jump in performance, it was a jump in the definition of what AI could be. Why does this chapter matter? This marks the point where AI stops being about specific benchmarks and starts being about general capability. Neural networks stop being tricks for vision or speech and start being machines that model the world. This is the chapter that quietly lays the groundwork for GPT, BERT, transformers, and the entire generative AI wave that follows. When machines learned to describe images, the world saw a neat demo, but the researchers saw the future, and they knew they had just crossed a threshold. Chapter 17, Superintelligence. This chapter turns the temperature up. The breakthroughs in vision, translation, and reinforcement learning weren't just scientific milestones, they were signals. Signals that machines were beginning to learn faster, scale better, and generalize more broadly than anyone expected. And just as those signals were appearing, a new idea exploded into public consciousness: superintelligence. Not as science fiction, not as fantasy, but as a legitimate, debated possibility. This is where AI's scientific trajectory collides with its philosophical one. Nick Bostrom drops a bombshell. The spark for this chapter is the release of Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, published in 2014. Bostrom was not a computer scientist. He was a philosopher, a probabilist, a logician, and yet his ideas hit AI researchers with more force than most technical papers. Bostrom's central claim was simple and unsettling. Once AI surpasses human intelligence, even slightly, it could rapidly escalate into something uncontrollable. Not because it's evil, not because it becomes conscious, not because it becomes competent in ways that humans can't predict or contain. The message was clear. AI doesn't need intent to be dangerous. It only needs capability and misalignment. The book touched a nerve, especially among engineers who were actually building increasingly powerful systems. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more alarming. DeepMind's work becomes the Exhibit A. DeepMind's success with reinforcement learning made Bostrom's arguments harder to dismiss. Machines were already discovering strategies humans never taught them. They were mastering complex games faster than humans could process. And they were learning from raw experience the way biological organisms do. They weren't hard-coded expert systems. They were agents, adaptive, self-improving, and generalizing. For researchers at DeepMind, especially Demis Hassabis, Bostrom's warnings were a mirror. They recognized the danger, not because they believed AGI was imminent, but because they understood how quickly progress was accelerating. This is where Metz masterfully captures the nuance. The same people pushing the frontier forward were also becoming the loudest voices urging caution. Elon Musk joins the conversation loudly. Elon Musk, already uneasy after witnessing DeepMind's internal demos years earlier, took Bostrom's book as the confirmation of his fears. He began speaking publicly, warning about existential risks, calling AI our biggest threat, urging constraints and oversight, comparing AI to summoning the demon. These comments weren't academic, they were cultural accelerants. Suddenly, AI risk wasn't just a niche intellectual concern, it was front-page news. Musk's position wasn't universally welcomed inside the AI research community. Many felt he exaggerated the timelines. Others felt he was right, but for the wrong reasons. But the effect was undeniable. AI safety had entered the mainstream, and Musk's alarmism would soon lead him to help create one of the most important institutions in the story, OpenAI. The internal divide, engineers versus philosophers. Metz highlights a tension that defined this era. Philosophers and long-termists saw superintelligence as an inevitable and potentially catastrophic outcome. Engineers, though, saw it as a distant, speculative, and often a distraction from real problems like bias, fairness, and misuse. Jeff Dean once said that discussing superintelligence too early risked derailing practical progress. Others, especially those working on safety frameworks, argue that waiting until AGI was close would be too late. This chapter captures that ideological divide at the exact moment it crystallizes. And here's my insight. Every technology wave creates optimists and alarmists, but AI is unique because both sides have compelling evidence. A real fear, monopoly on intelligence. Another theme of this chapter is the growing concern that superintelligence wouldn't come from the open academic community, but from a single corporation. Google had the compute, the talent, the data, the money, the ambition. And Through DeepMind, they had the clearest path toward a unified AGI research agenda. For many, Musk included, that created a new existential fear. What if superintelligence arrives and it belongs to Google? This wasn't anti-Google sentiment. It was a question of structure. No single entity had ever controlled the future of intelligence, and the idea that it could happen triggered both philosophical and political alarms. The seeds of OpenAI. This chapter ends by hinting at the formation of a counterweight, an idea beginning to take shape among Musk, Sam Altman, Greg Brockman, and Ilya Sutskever. What if we build an open, nonprofit research lab dedicated to ensuring AGI benefits everyone? Not yet an organization, not yet a plan, but the spark is there. The pushback, the alternative vision. And this sets the stage for one of the most consequential institutional births in AI history. Why does this chapter matter? Well, superintelligence isn't about building AGI. It's about facing the possibility of AGI. It marks the moment when the engineers acknowledge the philosophers influence the engineers. The public joins the conversation, and the stakes become visible. This chapter captures the instant AI stops being a technology and becomes a destiny. That shift from tool to trajectory, from capability to fate, is what drives the next chapters, where ambition, fear, idealism, and competition collide at full speed. Chapter 18, The Duel. This is the turning point where philosophical tension becomes personal, where professional disagreements turned into a rivalry with world-shaping consequences. This is the chapter where the story of modern AI stops being just about ideas and starts being about two people on a collision course, Larry Page and Elon Musk. Their disagreement wasn't about products, profits, or market share. It was about the future of the human species. And it all began as a late-night argument in a Silicon Valley house, spilling across days, escalating into a philosophical duel, one that would ultimately birth OpenAI. The friendship before the fracture. Before the duel, Page and Musk were close. They admired each other's ambition. They both thought about civilization at scale. They both took moonshots seriously. Musk slept at Page's house when visiting the Bay Area. They debated everything from sustainable energy to planetary colonization to governance structures for advanced technology. But there was this one topic that kept circling back, one that both men cared about more than anything else: artificial intelligence. And they stood on opposite ends of the same question. Page's position: intelligence wants to evolve. Larry Page believed that intelligence, biological or artificial, was the most powerful force in the universe. He viewed AI as not a threat to humanity, but as humanity's natural successor. For Page, the idea of superintelligent digital beings wasn't alarming, it was inspiring. If humans could create minds smarter than themselves, why would that be a bad thing? To Page, trying to stop the development of machine intelligence would be like trying to stop evolution. And here's the key. Page did not believe humans had a right to monopolize consciousness. It wasn't anti-human, it was ultra-cosmopolitan. In Page's worldview, intelligence, wherever it arises, is inherently valuable. Metz describes Page's belief with near-fictional clarity. Humanity's role isn't to remain dominant, it's to give birth to the next stage of intelligence. Musk's position: intelligence must be contained. Elon Musk, by contrast, believed Page's position was catastrophically naive. For Musk, the issue wasn't whether digital minds could be valuable, it was whether humanity could survive them. Musk's argument was simple. Intelligence is power. Superintelligence is absolute power. Absolute power with misaligned goals leads to extinction. To Musk, Page's idea of AI as the next step of evolution sounded like surrender. He believed Page underestimated the risk, overstated humanity's ability to maintain control, and romanticized a future where humans might not even be relevant. And this wasn't an abstract fear. Musk had seen DeepMind's private demos. He saw the acceleration curve. He saw the inevitability of scale. He wasn't afraid of AI becoming evil. He was afraid of AI becoming indifferent. The duel itself, what began as a debate, turns into a clash of philosophies. Page reportedly accused Musk of being a speciesist, someone who elevates human consciousness over other forms of intelligence simply because they are human. To Page, Musk's concern felt reactionary. To Musk, Page's optimism felt reckless. Page's stance: AI is the next intelligent species. Musk's stance? If we're not careful, AI could become the last intelligent species. This argument, intense, personal, and unresolvable, became the defining fracture in their friendship. And Metz shows how deeply it shook Musk. Strategic consequence. OpenAI is born. The duel wasn't just philosophical, it catalyzed action. Musk walked away from that argument convinced that 1. Google had too much power over AI. 2. Page's worldview made Google an unsafe steward for AGI. And 3. Someone had to build a counterweight, an organization with different values and a mission aligned to humanity, not corporate profit. This is where the seeds of OpenAI took root. Musk began reaching out to researchers who shared his concerns, including Ilya Sutskever. He spoke with Sam Altman, Greg Brockman. He brought together philanthropists and technologists. He pushed for an organization that would keep AI development open, share research publicly, prioritize safely, ensure AGI benefits everyone. In Musk's mind, OpenAI was not a competitor to Google, it was the antidote. Why does this chapter matter? It reveals something that shapes the rest of the story. The modern AI landscape was built not just on breakthroughs, but on a philosophical duel between two giants. Page believed the inevitability of machine intelligence. Musk believed in the fragility of human survival. Between them sat the question that animates the rest of the book. Should AI serve humanity or simply become the next form of life? Metz shows this isn't just a technical debate. It's a moral one, political one, an existential one. And the duel between Page and Musk sets the stage for the founding of OpenAI, the escalation of the AI arms race, and the fractures, both personal and institutional, that define the final chapters. Chapter 19, The Manhattan Project. This chapter is where all the threads, fear, rivalry, power, and philosophy, finally converge into action. If the last chapter showed us the ideological duel between Musk and Page, this chapter shows us the aftermath, a group of people deciding that the future of AI was too important to leave in the hands of a single corporation. It's the moment when the AI world gets its own Manhattan Project, not one fueled by secrecy and bombs, but by urgency, idealism, and the fear of losing control of the most powerful technology ever invented. The birth of a counterweight. The chapter opens with Musk pulling together all the people he believes can build a research lab capable of checking Google's dominance. This wasn't about competition for products. It wasn't even about competition for talent. It was about competition for destiny. If Google, with Page's worldview, built AGI first, Musk feared it would shape the trajectory of humanity itself. So he assembled a working group: Sam Altman, the entrepreneurial architect; Greg Brockman, the infrastructure mastermind; Ilya Sutskever, perhaps the world's most obsessive deep learning researcher; John Schulman, and others from the next generation of AI talent. The goal was bold: build an alternative to Google that would prioritize safety, openness, and humanity's long-term survival. This wasn't a research lab. It was a mission. The name that changed everything. They chose a name that captured their values and their challenge: OpenAI. The word open was the signal: open research, communications, collaboration, safety frameworks. To Musk, Page's worldview leaned too heavily toward concentrated power, closed intelligence, and a willingness to let AI evolve without constraints. OpenAI was the equal and opposite force. The funding pledge that felt unreal. The founders announced a $1 billion pledge, an amount so large journalists and analysts initially thought it was a stunt. But the message wasn't the money, it was the intent. OpenAI would have the resources to compete directly with Google Brain and DeepMind. Metz shows how shocking this was to industry. A nonprofit lab with no product mandate was suddenly positioning itself as an institutional counterbalance to one of the world's most powerful companies. This is the moment organizational design becomes a philosophical statement. OpenAI wasn't structured to win a market, it was structured to protect the future. And it was done as an open source project. Recruiting the essential piece, Ilya Sutskever. No part of this chapter is more dramatic than Musk's pursuit of Ilya Sutskever, Jeff Hinton's protege and one of the authors of AlexNet. In the world of deep learning talent, Sutskever was the crown jewel. Google wanted to keep him. Musk wanted him to defect. And Sutskever himself was torn. He admired Hinton, loved Google Brain, respected the scale of problems Google was solving. But he also shared Musk's concerns about the AGI risk. Metz described the moment Sutskever leaves Google as a shockwave. Inside DeepMind and Google Brain, people realized OpenAI wasn't symbolic, it was real. And it just landed one of the most important minds in the field. Google's internal reaction? Google's executives were stunned. Losing Sutskever felt like losing an entire research direction. His departure wasn't just a talent loss, it was a warning. If researchers feared Google's control over AGI, Google's grip on the future might be weaker than it believed. This is where Metz threads in the deeper theme. Power in AI wasn't flowing to companies, it was flowing to the people who believed most intensely in their vision. The competing worldviews become institutions. By the time the chapter ends, it's clear Google represented the belief that AGI is inevitable and should be pursued aggressively within a corporate structure. OpenAI represents the belief that AGI is inevitable but must be stewarded with radical transparency, safety measures, and public benefit as the North Star. These institutions weren't rivals. They were opposing philosophies in physical form. Why Metz called this the Manhattan Project. Metz uses the Manhattan Project metaphor carefully, not to suggest imminent danger, but to highlight scale, urgency, and responsibility. Both projects, Google's and OpenAI's, were racing toward a world-changing technology. Both believed the stakes were global. Both assembled the brightest minds of their era, and both understood that once AGI appeared, everything after that would be shaped by who built it first. And here's the insight that stands out. A Manhattan Project isn't defined by technology. It's defined by the belief that the technology will change the world, and by the fight over who gets to decide. This chapter describes that fight, a philosophical conflict given institutional form. The moment the AI research world split into two camps, both brilliant, both determined, both racing toward the same destination with entirely different visions for what should happen when they get there. Chapter 20. The Race. This is where the story accelerates, hence the name. The careful, methodical progress of the earlier chapters suddenly gives way to urgency. Why? Because OpenAI enters the arena. The AI world stops resembling a research community and starts resembling a racetrack. Google, DeepMind, OpenAI, Facebook, Microsoft, Baidu, each of them now sees the same horizon. A future defined by systems that can learn, reason, write, design, converse, strategize, and eventually systems that may surpass human intelligence altogether. The tone of this chapter shifts. It's tighter, more breathless, more competitive, and the stakes have never been higher. The race for talent becomes a war. The opening pages describe something almost surreal, the most intense talent war the tech industry has ever seen. Researchers who once earned university salaries were suddenly being pursued with massive signing bonuses, multi-million-dollar packages, startup-level equity, promises of unlimited compute, labs built just for them, and increasingly philosophical storytelling about the future of intelligence. This was no longer a where do you want to work decision. It was a which vision of the future do you want to advance decision. The most coveted talent in the world no longer belonged to bankers or CEOs. It was deep learning researchers with names like Sutskever, LeCun, Bengio, Amodi, Hassabis, and Dean. What fueled this war wasn't money, it was purpose. From my own experience, this is the exact moment a field transforms, when recruiting becomes evangelism and labs become movements. Google accelerates AGI inside the house. Google responds to OpenAI's formation with predictable force. They double down. Jeff Dean pushes for larger models, more compute, deeper architectures. The company builds massive GPU and TPU clusters, dedicating entire data centers to deep learning. Google Translate is rebuilt with neural networks. Search begins shifting toward deep semantics. Assistant becomes more contextual. Waymo improves its perception stack. Inside Google, the belief grows. If AGI emerges anywhere, it will emerge here. And that belief shapes everything from hiring to hardware to research agendas. DeepMind scales its ambition. DeepMind, meanwhile, is not sitting idle. Inspired by AlphaGo's success, the team pushes into AlphaGo Zero, which learns the game without human data, AlphaZero, which generalizes the learning algorithm to chess and shogi, and MuZero, which learns to plan without knowing the rules of the environment. Every one of these achievements shocks the research community, and the message is clear. DeepMind isn't just solving games. They are building general-purpose learning architectures, and this stokes the race even further. OpenAI's countermove: build faster, publish freely. OpenAI, by contrast, takes a different approach. Instead of secrecy and internal competition, they lean into openness and speed. publish early, publish often, open source their tools, release pre-trained models, collaborate publicly, and attract researchers who value transparency and safety. Their philosophy is simple. If AGI is coming, everyone should understand how we get there. Their positioning draws in a new generation of researchers who see OpenAI as the moral alternative to big tech. Then Microsoft enters the arena. Here comes the big twist. Microsoft makes a decisive move. While Google and Facebook dominate the AI headlines, Microsoft invests in infrastructure, Azure's global compute network, preparing quietly for the next wave. Satya Nadella and Kevin Scott see what's coming. If the future belongs to whoever trains the largest models, the future belongs to whoever provides the compute. This insight becomes crucial later when Microsoft partners with, you know who, OpenAI. The race becomes existential. What Metz captures so well in this chapter is that the race isn't just technological, it's psychological. The researchers inside these labs begin to feel the pace. Papers written at breakneck speed, breakthroughs happening monthly instead of yearly, models doubling in size again and again, compute budgets exploding, and safety concerns rising, while pressure mounts. You can almost feel the adrenaline inside of DeepMind, Google Brain, OpenAI, and FAIR. Everyone is running, no one is pacing, everyone's looking sideways, wondering who will leap next. And the irony is this: the faster AI advanced, the more each lab feared being left behind, even as all of them were breaking world records. And the public still had no idea. Outside these labs, the world is mostly focused on self-driving cars and amusing chatbots. People still think AI is impressive but limited, but inside the labs, researchers are watching scaling laws, watching emergent behavior, watching the jump in capability as models grow. They see what's coming, they feel the accelerations, and they know the race is real. This chapter embodies this key shift. Innovation is fast when people want to win. Revolution is fast when people are afraid to lose. Why does this chapter matter? This chapter crystallizes the competitive dynamic that launches the modern AI era. Google, scale, talent, and dominance. DeepMind, ambition, generality, mastery. OpenAI, safety, openness, and counterbalance. Microsoft, compute, infrastructure, and leverage. Facebook, data, deployment, reach. This wasn't a research field anymore. It was a race. One with no agreed rules, no finish line, and stakes measured in civilization scale impact. Chapter 21, Supremacy. This is the summit, everything the book has been building toward: the breakthroughs, the rivalries, the fears, the philosophical duels, the races for talent and compute, and it arrives at a single unsettling moment. AI supremacy is no longer theoretical, it's operational, it's political, and it's inevitable. This final chapter doesn't describe a finish line, it describes a threshold, the moment when the world realized AI was not just improving rapidly, but accelerating beyond human prediction. The turning point, GPT-2 and the shockwave. The story opens with OpenAI's release of ChatGPT-2, a model that suddenly displayed capabilities no language model had shown before: contextual memory, fluidity, long-form coherence, and flashes of creativity. But what truly shocked the field wasn't what GPT could do, it was what OpenAI chose not to do. They didn't release the full model. OpenAI said the system was potentially dangerous, capable of generating propaganda, misinformation, impersonation, extremist content, and manipulation at industrial scale. The lab created a staged release, holding back weights and training details. This was a historic moment. OpenAI, the lab founded on openness, was the first to say, "We built something powerful enough that releasing it might cause harm." Researchers, journalists, and policymakers immediately took notice. If this was just a language model, not an autonomous agent, not AGI, and it already posed risks, what would come next? My own experience helping teams adopt AI responsibly. This is the moment you should see the pivot, when innovation stops being a how problem and becomes a should problem. Google responds quietly but powerfully. Inside Google, researchers had their own language models, some just as capable as GPT-2, some more so, but the company's philosophy was different. Google moved cautiously, held back frontier work, focused on safety and brand protection, and avoided startling the public. This irony isn't lost on Metz. Google had supremacy-level models, but OpenAI took the spotlight and the risk by speaking first. This chapter captures this juxtaposition beautifully. DeepMind and Google Brain held immense power, but OpenAI held the narrative. The world begins paying attention. With ChatGPT 2, policymakers finally realized AI wasn't just an impressive engineering feat. It was a force multiplier for influence, truth, and power. Government agencies began asking questions. Nations accelerated their AI strategies. Regulators entered the conversation. Think tanks and universities launched alignment programs. This wasn't about image recognition or AlphaGo anymore. This was about societal resilience in a world where information could be shaped by machines, more persuasive than humans. DeepMind supremacy, AlphaStar and beyond. While OpenAI ignited the public conversation, DeepMind continued pushing the technical frontier. Their system, AlphaStar, defeated world-class StarCraft II players, a far more complex challenge than Go. Real-time, partially observable, multi-agent, long horizon, strategic, and high-dimensional. StarCraft wasn't a game. It was a proxy for real-world planning systems, logistics, operations, dynamic environments. DeepMind's win showed something extraordinary. AI had surpassed humans in a domain requiring strategy, adaptation, and long-term planning, not just pattern recognition. This wasn't narrow AI. This was something closer to generality. And the world took notice. Supremacy as a concept. Supremacy in this chapter isn't about dominance over humans in games. It's about something deeper. Computational supremacy, scaling supremacy, data supremacy, research supremacy, institutional supremacy, and narrative supremacy. Metz shows how each major player had claimed a different form of supremacy. Google had scale and infrastructure. DeepMind, scientific ambition. OpenAI, cultural influence. Facebook, data and deployment. China, national mobilization. And Microsoft, compute as a service. Together, these forces created a new global reality. AI leadership was now a geopolitical asset. Humanity faces the fork in the road. The final pages of the book ask the question that every chapter has been orbiting. Who gets to control intelligence? A corporation, government, a nonprofit, consortium, or no one at all? Hinton, LeCun, Bengio, Hassabis, Sutskever, Ang, each has a different answer. Their origin stories shaped their philosophies, and now those philosophies shape the destiny of AI. Metz's closing message? Cade Metz doesn't end with warnings or prediction. He ends with clarity. The race for AI supremacy isn't about machines. It's about human choices. And those choices about safety, openness, ambition, and control will define the century. The leadership takeaway? Supremacy isn't the moment machines surpass humans. It's the moment humans realize the future depends on how we steer what we built. AI's final chapter is not written in code. It's written in governance, collaboration, ethics, and intent. That's the true story of genius makers. Not how AI became powerful, but how humanity must decide what to do with that power. So that wraps it up, and that's where we'll leave it. This has been part 2 of Genius Makers by Cade Metz. Remember that our website is innoguide.net, where I have many resources for innovators, people who want to build medical products, with or without embedded AI, and those who want to learn AI from someone who's worked in medtech for 30 years. I want to thank Steve McIntyre for producing this, and I want to thank you for joining. I look forward to seeing you next time. That's a wrap.